Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Rocco, and today we're going to be reviewing another album, going back to one of my all-time favorite bands, Genesis. And today we're going to be talking about their 10th album from 1980, Duke. I'm a huge fan of this one, guys. A really big fan of Duke. It's such a satisfying album on so many levels and really feels like a cohesive piece of work. Whereas the last few Genesis albums, although they were fantastic, do feel like kind of like this assembly of songs, this kind of mishmash of different styles. Duke is just a really tight, really cohesive album. And it was the big break for the band, believe it or not. I know, coming 10 years into their career, this album here is what really brought in a much wider audience onto the music of Genesis, because this album here has a lot of great singles, very commercial sounding, and it's easy to see why the masses would definitely embrace this album with open arms. So, it could be a contentious it could be a contentious album with Genesis fans. You got those prog rock aficionados that think that everything after Steve Hackett was shit. And then there were three, Duke, and then so on and so forth. But for me, this album here is it's just great. You have to look at it in isolation. You can't really look at it and compare it to masterpieces like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and the Selling England by the Pound, Foxtrot, albums like that. This is a different band at this point. They have evolved and they've adopted a more succinct commercial sound. But you know what? This is still what I would consider kind of a transitional Genesis album, because there's still a lot of those progressive rock elements from the past. I mean, look no further than the 10.5-minute closing epic, Duke's Travels and Duke's End. I mean, that one there is just progressive rock at its absolute zenith, and a pretty bold statement to be coming out in 1980. But so this album still does have a lot of those prog elements, but it has those short pop rock singles that are just irresistible, and they're done so well. The songwriting is there, and really the whole album it's great. It has this amazing flow that runs throughout it. It feels so cohesive. Love the lyrics. Love Phil Collins' vocal delivery. And so what if, the band went a little bit more commercial? It's not a big deal. I mean, what's wrong with that, guys? We already have eight to nine Genesis albums of pure progressive rock excellence. So what if they veered off into more commercial territory? What's the big deal? I don't know. I never got it. I don't want to rant. I don't want to debate about this album any longer in terms of the commerciality. Let's just talk about the nitty gritty behind it. Let's talk about the actual music on it and what makes it so great, rather than all this bullshit politics and, Peter Gabriel versus the post-Peter Gabriel years and whatnot. I'm just sick of it. I'm sure we're all sick of it up to this point. Let's just focus on the music and not talk about the politics. So the album Dukes, trying to look back to the first time I heard this album. It was a while ago, actually, back when I was in grade 10. And right from the start, this album really took me by surprise. I recognized a lot of the songs that they would play on the radio. For example, Misunderstanding, Turn It On Again, things like that. Which gave the album this nice sense of familiarity. But the other songs really turned me on as well. And when I got to the ending with Duke's Travels, Duke's End, I'd already been familiar with the progressive era of Genesis, and that song there just took me by complete surprise, because it was up there with the best of them, I'm telling you. And there's this one particular moment on that track that just always gives me goosebumps and shivers up and down my spine. We'll talk about it later, but needless to say, I was extremely happy when I heard this album, and since then, it's always been one of my favorites. I mean, not too long ago, this album here was actually my favorite outside of the whole Peter Gabriel era. Only in recent years, Trick of the Tail kind of surpassed it a bit, but not by a lot. I would still consider these two albums kind of interchangeable in terms of how much I like them. So yeah, really special album for me. It would definitely be in my top 100 albums of all time. So one of my personal favorites. Listened to this album so many times over the years, like countless fucking times. And it's a really emotional album. And it's really impacted me throughout my entire life. So it's just an album that I'm really passionate about, and I'm just so happy to be talking about right now. But and yeah, another funny story about this album is that my uncle, who's a longtime Genesis fan, he actually told me that this was his favorite album by the band, and he knew Genesis way back. I think starting with the Trick of the Tail era. So it really goes to show that, if you put all the politics and bullshit aside, you can and really appreciate this album for what it is and forget that it's not like a progressive rock masterpiece. I think you'll really enjoy it and really give it a few listens, and I think it'll grow on you guys. So anyway, that's kind of like my preamble to the album. Now let's get into the history and background behind Duke. It's really interesting. Alright, so continuing on with the saga of Genesis. So the year is 1978, and Genesis had released Trick of the Tail. They were doing really well for themselves. I mean, surprisingly, ever since Peter Gabriel left the band, their audience had kept growing and growing and growing. And although they weren't selling out massive stadiums and massive arenas, they were doing really well for themselves. A really well-respected and successful kind of middle of the range kind of band. They were never huge like, AC/DC or Queen or anything like that, but they were doing well for themselves and had a pretty nice sizable audience. So come 1978, and it was time to tour A Trick of the Tail. And then there were three, which had the hit single Follow You, Follow Me. So that album there was really the transition into more commercially accessible material for the band. If you've seen my previous review, you'll know that there's still plenty of progressive rock material, but the songs were definitely shorter, definitely more compact, and that brought in a wider range of people to their shows. So I keep saying Trick of the Tail. And then there were three tour, was a massive tour, and at the time, Phil Collins had just been married. He'd been married for like about a year now. They started having some kids, and family life was strained because he had all these obligations with his bands. Let's not forget, Phil Collins was also in the side project Brand X. The guy was extremely busy just with music, and his wife realized that he wasn't really making time for the family, which must have been a really common concern back then with all the, the rock star, with the whole rock star lifestyle. Not that I would consider Phil Collins a rock star, but I guess the whole musician kind of thing. And she gave him an ultimatum. She said, listen, if you commit to playing all these shows for the And Then There Were Three tour, which was like ridiculous, by the way, she's like, I'm not going to be here when you get back, because really, like, what's the point of having a relationship when you're on the road like 2/3 or more of the year? And Phil Collins at the time, he knew Genesis were going to make it big. Like, he knew they were on the verge of something. Again, with the song Follow You, Follow Me, and like the big audiences they were drawing in at this point relative to the past, he couldn't resist going on that fucking tour. So Phil Collins, he went on the tour, and needless to say, after the tour, he went back, had to rush to Vancouver, where his wife had suddenly moved. She's like, yep, you know what? You went on the tour, fuck you. I'm moving to Vancouver with the kids. And he basically rushed there to save the marriage. The band had to put everything on hold, and Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford understood. Again, they'd been together for a long time, and going through all that shit with Peter Gabriel, how they were pretty much dicks towards him and didn't really understand his problems, what he was going through with his wife and the difficult birth of their first child. I think they learned a lesson, so they let it go this time, and Genesis was basically on hold. So Phil Collins goes to Vancouver, tries to save his marriage, and the other band members, they're just sitting on their asses. They're like, you know what? Let's make some albums, because they probably had a lot of songs in the bank. So Tony Banks made his debut solo album. I believe it was called I can't remember the name at the top of my head right now, but I think A Curious Feeling. And Mike Rutherford made his album The Small Creeps Day, which I haven't heard yet, but there's a 20-minute track on that album, so I'm definitely going to have to give it a listen one of these days. But it isn't really highly regarded as being a masterpiece or anything, but still, I should have heard it by now, being the big Genesis fanatic that I am. So anyway, those guys were keeping busy, and Phil Collins is at home basically trying to save the marriage. And, I wish I could say it had a happy ending, but it didn't. And Phil Collins ended up getting divorced. His whole marriage fell apart. And he was in a pretty dark place at the time. And I really think that marriage falling apart was the catalyst of what made this album so fantastic. So in a selfish kind of way, I'm kind of happy that Phil Collins lost his fucking marriage, as horrible as that sounds. But yeah, I'm just happy with the final result. So he came back. So he wanted to get things rolling again with Genesis. But again, Tony Banks and Rutherford, they were in the middle of like mixing their solo albums. So Phil Collins had a lot of time on his hands. Did some gigs with Brand X, which it's just amazing, by the way, how he had time to do all this different stuff. And then he started writing his own songs, which ended up being the basis for the album Face Value, his debut album. Now, I don't want to get off on a tangent with Phil Collins' solo career, and I'm not going to, but let's just say I'm not a huge fan of it. It's good, and I respect it for what it is, but I've never been big on Phil Collins' solo career, so forgive me for that if you guys are big fans. But yeah, he started writing a lot of songs, and this was rare for Phil Collins. Usually he was more of an improvisational jam kind of guy. He would go into the studio and just let his creativity flow like wildfire and really just come up with things on the spot. But here he was just writing songs, pouring his heart out, And in that process of writing songs, he ended up finding his inner voice and inner passion. Because when you're writing your own songs, you really have to figure out how to emote those lyrics, how to really present those songs. And that's, a very, very significant point in every songwriter's life, and especially every vocalist's life. Because it's easy to just be presented with lyrics and try to sing them. And it's hard to get the emotion across. But when you're writing from the heart, you really develop a whole different style of emoting your music and phrasing everything. So this is really where Phil Collins had developed as a singer. And again, he'd had some fantastic moments in the past. I'm thinking about Afterglow from Wind and Wuthering and so many other powerful moments, Squonk. But this album here is where he really broke out of his shell and gave one of the best vocal performances, not only in his career, but in Genesis history. That's right, even comparing it to Peter Gabriel. But yeah, so Phil Collins was doing that. So what ended up happening? So Genesis ended up reconvening in autumn of 1979, and things were quite different this time because the previous three albums, the ones after Peter Gabriel left the band, all consisted of Banks and Rutherford bringing in preconceived songs, or sometimes Hackett as well, that were kind of already fully written, fully formed, and the band just had to really perform them and play them in the studio and lay them down on tape. So really like a very uncohesive way of writing songs. But on this album, things were different because Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford had basically exhausted their storehouse of songs for their solo albums. And here Phil Collins was with a shitload of songs. Again, he hadn't recorded his debut album yet, but he had written a lot of the tracks that would end up being on it. And it was weird because, Phil Collins, again, wasn't known as a songwriter, and all of a sudden here he was with a lot of his songs. So the story goes that he presented a lot of these tracks to Genesis as Genesis songs. And some of them ended up on the album. Misunderstanding, the big hit there, and also, oh my god, what's the other song he wrote? It'll come to me later. But some of them ended up on the album, and that's not to say Banks and Rutherford didn't have some preformed songs. Rutherford had Man of Our Times, Banks had Cul De Sac, guide vocal, things like that, but much less than their previous albums. But a lot of the Collins songs that they had heard, they kind of rejected as being they weren't really Genesis material. They didn't sound like something that Genesis would do. And Phil Collins didn't take offense to that whatsoever. He's like, yeah, no problem. I mean, like, I agree with you there. Like, this is me writing songs for the first time, so obviously it's not gonna be suitable for Genesis. But here's the funny story. Apparently, Tony Banks says that if Phil Collins had shown them the song In the Air Tonight, which is by far probably the best Phil Collins solo song, then he would have wanted it on Duke. And to this day, Phil Collins does say that he did show Tony Banks the song, and it was one of those tracks that they rejected as being un-Genesis-like. So it's a point of contention to this day. They debated each other furiously. Banks saying he never heard it up to that point. Collins saying he showed it to him because he was proud. I kind of believe Collins, to be honest. I think Banks, he's kind of looking back, kind of embarrassed about it, embarrassed about not putting it on the album, and using history and things being forgotten in the sands of time as his way of backing himself up there. But you never know. You really don't. And it would make sense for Phil Collins to kind of hoard that song for himself because it is a really atmospheric, dark, and special track in his canon. And yeah, by far my favorite Phil Collins solo track. So, you never know, but I don't know, Tony Banks, there's something suspicious about that dude. Don't quite trust him. So anyway, they got it to the studio, and as a result of them not having these preconceived songs, it was a really nice, really collaborative process, and they really got to work together, and I think that's what gives this album this cohesive feel. And their original concept for it was they had originally written this long-ass 25-minute epic called the Duke Suite, because apparently they gave it that name because the opening of the song, which would end up being the opening of Behind the Lines and kind of like the main theme of the entire album, had this regal, royal kind of feel. So they just titled it Duke, and it was supposed to be like this huge concept. But at the end of the day, they decided to break up that suite into about 4 or 5 different songs and scatter them throughout the album because they didn't want people comparing it to Supper's Ready, which I think is a stupid excuse. I think if anything, they should have realized that this is 1980 here, and a long 25-minute epic isn't going to be easily digestible by the general public, especially coming out of the new wave and punk era at the time. That was just not the right move. So I'm glad they did it. But the reason they gave to not be compared to Supper's Ready is kind of a stupid reason, because who cares if you're comparing it to Supper's Ready? Like, first of all, it sounds nothing like Supper's Ready. Second of all, like, what's wrong with having another epic track to really talk about in the Genesis canon? So, Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is I agree with the final result, but the reason for why they did it is kind of stupid. Anyway, that's my little rant there. But yeah, so they recorded the album, and lo and behold, this album was a huge success. There were so many hit singles. Misunderstanding, um, Turn It On Again was also a big hit. Misunderstanding was the big hit in the U.S., and that must have felt good for Collins because that was one of his solo compositions that he brought into the band. And to this day, my friend, he always gets he always tells me he gets a little bit annoyed because they play this song so consistently on our local rock station that he's gotten sick of it over the years. Surprisingly, I've still never gotten sick of this track. And but yeah, he also can't believe it's Genesis because it sounds so much like a Phil Collins solo song, but a really good one at that. So I love Misunderstanding. So it was a huge commercial breakthrough for them. Went to #1 on the UK charts, their first #1 album, and #11 on the Billboard. So I believe that was their highest chart position as well. And again, it really transformed Genesis from a band that was doing well for themselves, surviving and making a good living for themselves, into superstars. And that would further be solidified with their next few albums. Then Invisible Touch, they were playing and selling out massive fucking stadiums. So really interesting and really ironic that a band this late into their career kind of made it big. But I always found that really interesting about Genesis. They're the only band I can think of that ended up doing that. Even Yes, I mean, with 90125, that was a big hit for them in the 80s. But then after that, they never really maintained those big sellout albums, whereas Genesis did. So yeah, Duke, really big turning point for the band. And, a really big turning point in the way they approach music at that. Born out of necessity because Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford didn't have any songs to bring into the writing of this album. But that really allowed the album to be a much more collaborative process. And that was a philosophy that Genesis would really live by for the rest of their career, basically. Like all the albums after this were all collaboratively written, and it gives them a nice, again, cohesive and unified feel. Again, with three members in the band, it's really easy to just write together. And Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, and Phil Collins really enjoyed that. It was much less stressful than the past, especially in the Peter Gabriel days, where you got 5 members in the band and huge egos clashing and different ideas, and it was just a mess. It produced great results, but it was a fucking mess. This was way more streamlined, and the band loved it. And it's easy to see why, even though Phil Collins' solo career really skyrocketed with face value, he stuck to Genesis for so many more years, over 10 more years to be exact. So, his heart was in the right place, and they were really getting a lot of musical satisfaction from what they were doing. So anyway, guys, that's the history behind Duke. Now let's get into my overall review. All right, so the album Duke. It's going to be kind of tough to summarize what makes this album so great, what makes it one of my favorites, but I think it really comes down to 3 things. And the first thing I want to talk about is just the emotional impact of this album. Now, I wouldn't really call this album a concept album per se. Again, that Duke suite they had, it did have this loose concept based over this Albert character who apparently just fell in love with his television set or something stupid like that. And really, I think it was just a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing that Phil Collins would say live, just as one of those funny interludes between songs. I don't think it was actually the concept behind this album. So I would take that with a grain of salt when you read that this album was based over a man who fell in love with his TV set. At its heart, I really think that this album here just perfectly reflects Phil Collins' divorce and the heartfelt emotional turmoil that he was going through. And again, that's why I say that I'm kind of happy that Phil Collins ended up getting divorced, because you could tell that, man, this guy is just so into it. His heart is in the right place, and he's just pouring out his soul, pouring out his emotion. He sounds like so much more of a singer. And I'm sure that every album review of Duke has to mention Phil Collins' vocal performance, because it really is a tour de force. I mean, his singing on here is absolutely passionate, absolutely powerful at some points, and just honestly a great vocal performance. This was probably the first time where people really looked at Phil Collins and said, that is one of the best singers of our times. Because back then, with the Trick of the Tail, Wind and Wuthering, he was getting the job done. Sure, there were those occasional signs, like again, I always mention Afterglow and things like that as being like real strong vocal highlights. But overall, he was kind of just going with the flow and singing the pre-presented songs. So I really think the emotional weight he gives to this performance is incredible, and as well as the lyrics. This album lyrically is a vast improvement over And Then There Were Three, because that album there, it really had a lot of those cheesy fantasy inspired lyrics by Tony Banks, which don't really do much for me. Again, early in Genesis, Peter Gabriel mastered that thing, but he would include all these elements of surrealism and really make the song cinematic and come to life with his quirkiness. Tony Banks' lyrics just basically stripped out everything interesting from the fantasy of early Genesis albums and just replaced them with cheesiness. So the lyrics here are extremely heartfelt, deal with much more realistic themes. Again, divorce, separation, things like that, that I'm sure that a lot of people can relate to, and give the album this emotional sense of realism that a lot of the other Genesis albums didn't have. So in that sense, it kind of does feel like a concept album, because a lot of those songs have those heartfelt themes. So really big improvement over And Then There Were Three in the lyrics department and the vocal department. Another huge improvement of this album over And Then There Were Three is just the flow from song to song. This whole album just feels like such a tight, cohesive unit. And, that could be because a big part of this album was supposed to be this long, extended suite, which would have had multiple parts that would flow seamlessly within each other. And the first three tracks on the album were the first three parts of that suite. So again, the flow there is fantastic, but I'm just talking about in general. It has fantastic pacing. You get an upbeat rocker, then you get a ballad, then another upbeat rocker, then a more symphonic proggy song, then another ballad. It feels like the album never stays in one place for a long time, and the flow, again, is just great. On And Then There Were Three, it just felt like a mishmash of songs. Again, after the heartfelt undertow, you get the cheesy ballad of Big. It just clashes. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But this album here, it takes itself a lot more seriously in terms of the structure of the album. And again, reprising the album with Duke's End, which has that original opening riff, gives it that cohesive bookend feel that they hadn't really done since Trick of the Tail, to be honest, with Los Endos reprising a lot of the earlier themes. So really feels like a solid album in that sense. And the mix of songs on this album is just fantastic. I mean, some of the greatest Genesis ballads of all time. They never feel really sappy. Well, maybe the song Alone Tonight might be a little bit on that territory, but they always feel extremely sincere and extremely passionate. Now, a big difference between this and a lot of the other Genesis albums is they just feel so revitalized on this album. They wrote a few short, upbeat, catchy rock tunes. And in the past, when Genesis would write an accessible song, it would always be more on the ballady kind of side, like Follow You, Follow Me, Many Too Many, things like that. But here they finally mastered the art of writing a short 3 to 4 minute, upbeat, catchy pop rock tune, like Misunderstanding, Turn It On Again, the opening track as well. They really got in touch with their more energetic side and really let that flourish and expand on this album. So although I'm making it sound like this album is a downer with all these depressing ballads about Phil Collins' divorce, you do get those songs, but they're interspersed with these great, upbeat, catchy rock tunes that you just never get tired of. And that could also be because Mike Rutherford took on a more riff-driven guitar sound on this album. His guitar playing on this really has a lot more in common with classic rock than it did on And Then There Were Three, where I think that was the first album where he was playing lead guitar, and again, coming off the heels of Steve Hackett. He wasn't really trying to imitate Steve Hackett's sound, but his guitar sound had a lot more in common with Steve Hackett than it did on this album. So again, instead of getting those really somber, melodic guitar lines, you get more upbeat, punchy, kind of rocking guitar riffs on this album, which is really cool. And I really think that Mike Rutherford coming into his own as a guitar player, although it's more simplistic, a little bit less in common with the prog genre, really gave this album that edge, that heavier, not heavier, but that more rocking edge, that more upbeat edge that I was just talking about. So yeah, Mike Rutherford really coming into his own on this album and just settling into a style, a more riff-driven style that he would continue throughout his career. And you know what? We're talking about all these ballads and short, upbeat rock songs, but let's not forget, there's so many progressive elements on the album. Tony Banks' keyboard playing is, for me, a great improvement over And Then There Were Three. You don't really get those overbearing, in-your-face, effects-heavy synthesizer parts and synthesizer riffs. Like, for example, the intro of Burning Rope, it has that really overbearing synth riff. Also on the Lady Lies, things like that. Here it's just done much more tastefully, and you still get that epic symphonic feel, like especially on songs like Cul De Sac and Heathaze and things like that. Tony Banks really brings back that symphonic kind of sound, which is really cool to have on an album like this, because it's been a while since we got that big keyboard sound. Whereas on And Then There Were Three, it was just really this in-your-face, cheesy kind of synth sound. So again, an improvement there. It feels like this album is just improving on everything from And Then There Were Three. And of course, with the last 10.5 minute epic track, Duke's Travels slash Duke's End, you get that extremely complex and intricate prog rock extravaganza that really held on. That really, if you're a hardcore prog fan, you can't deny the greatness of this song. And I think that song there was really instrumental in keeping the prog fan base interested and engaged with Genesis. But even scattered throughout the album, you do get those progressive rock elements, especially Cul De Sac, and as I mentioned, Heathaze and things like that. So again, it's a perfect balance between accessible, progressive, heartfelt emotion, upbeat pop tunes. It's got it all, and the flow is fantastic. So really revitalize and energize Genesis, and it makes for one of their best albums in my opinion. So that's pretty much my overall review of Duke. Sadly, they would never write another album as great as this. I do like Abacab. I do like the experimentation and the reckless abandon. And the Genesis album after that, although side 1 is fantastic, side 2, it's decent. Invisible Touch as well. And they're all good albums, but they never really reached the heights of this album again. So kind of sad there. But anyway, there's still a lot of great stuff after this, so I'm not going to harp on that too much. So that's basically my review for Duke, guys. Now let's talk about this album track by track. What a fucking opener, guys. Behind the Lines. Every time I hear this song, I can't just help but have the widest smile on my face from ear to ear. It's just such a joyous, such an upbeat song. And really, it feels like this is a band that's just been revitalized, re-energized, and just ready to burst on the scenes of the music world, because it's just such a powerful song, guys. And really, it's kind of deceptively simple, because it starts off with those big, powerful, again, regal synthesizer chords from Tony Banks. The da, 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 da. It's a really simple synthesizer riff for Tony Banks, but yet it's so powerful, it's so joyous, so triumphant. It's just a mood lifter, guys. And again, they're bringing that intensity, they're bringing that immediacy that was missing on a lot of those other Genesis albums. And such a joyous thing. And, at first it could feel kind of repetitive, maybe the first or second time you hear the song, because this synthesizer-driven part, that main riff, kind of just goes throughout the first 2.5 minutes of the track, which is purely instrumental, by the way. But you really got to listen to what's going on underneath that synthesizer. The crazy bass lines, the absolutely powerhouse drumming performance by Phil Collins. Again, using the heavier side of his drumming. And all kinds of amazing guitar licks. There's some absolutely soaring guitar licks by Mike Rutherford during this section. So many climaxes, just build-ups and drop-offs, and man, it's just so cool. There's even a flute kind of sounding part. Obviously, it's a keyboard effect, not an actual flute, but it brings you back to those Peter Gabriel days when with that little flute section there. But overall, it's just a musical extravaganza for the first 2.5 minutes. It just literally lifts up your soul and just shows the band writing some fantastic upbeat music, which we haven't seen in a long, long time from these guys. Definitely one of their most joyous, upbeat, and immediate musical statements they made in their entire career up to this point, but yet it maintains that musical intricacy that we know and love from Genesis. But it doesn't meander at all. It's just straight up, straight to the point. And with all those euphoric climaxes, there's so many fucking climaxes in the first 2.5 minutes. You can't go wrong with this section. But the rest of the song is fantastic as well, and it's almost a shock when Phil Collins comes in with the vocals, because you think it's going to be an instrumental. It's been going on for so long, but when he comes in, it locks into this awesome groove, really held down by Mike Rutherford's bass, and Phil Collins just delivers a really great performance. This is what I consider the poppier section of the song. It's really accessible. There's some pretty poppy backup vocals on the track, and Phil Collins is using his softer, more high-pitched tone at some points in the song. But overall, it's a powerhouse performance, and he's not afraid to give it that power, to give it that oomph during the climaxes, especially when he sings the line, "Ah, you let me down, sounds like he's singing that from like you're thinking to yourself, like, where did that come from? Like, holy fuck. Like, where was Phil Collins hiding this vocal talent all these years? Because that part there is just awesome. There's some amazing bass playing on the second half of this track as well. Got to give Mike Rutherford credit where credit's due. Some absolutely pumping bass lines. And just a really great second half to the track. I mean, really, really emotional. Again, a lot of climaxes. This song is just so dynamic. There's so many ups and downs, and it's just, for a 5.5 minute song, one of the best, actually. One of the best songs on the album. I would easily give this a 9.5 out of 10. It's a big highlight for me, guys. And really the kind of quintessential track on the album, in my opinion. But classic song, Behind the Lines.
She never thought about the future. She just did what she would. Although she really cared about her music.
Track number 2, Duchess. One of the big highlights for me on the album, guys. One of my favorites. And it's part 2 of the whole aforementioned Duke suite. And you could really tell, because this perfectly transitions out of Behind the Lines when everything kind of dies down at the end of this track. And then, of all things, you get this weird drum machine riff coming in, or drum machine beat, I should say. The which is repeated for the first 2 minutes of the entire Duchess track, which is just insane. And, you know, now that I think about it, it's really funny how Phil Collins, of all people, one of the tightest, most intricate, world-renowned drummers of all time, had this fascination with drum machines. Usually you would think it would be someone, you know, a little bit less experienced, or maybe not a drummer at all, who would use the drum machine to kind of fill in the gaps here. But no, it was fucking Phil Collins. But again, that takes away nothing from his drumming performance on the album, which is absolutely fantastic. But the point I'm trying to make is the first 2 minutes of this track is this beautiful, haunting section, which is really the backbone of the track is that drum machine kind of beat, but there's so much going on underneath. There's Tony Banks on the piano just doing these beautiful, sparse, melodic lines, and Mike Rutherford as well with some tinkling guitar passages. It's just really ominous. Sounds like you're exploring a deep, dark cave in the middle of nowhere with no end in sight, and it's really atmospheric and really shows that the band never lost their experimental edge. Like, they're willing to start off this track, which is really poppy and really accessible, by the way, with a 2-minute avant-garde atmospheric instrumental section. So really cool. Reminds me of something off The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, like Silent Sorrow and Empty Boats or Ravine or something like that. Just something to really set up the atmosphere. But then you get this piano build-up that comes in, and it's just perfect. And before you know it, the song fully explodes, and Phil Collins comes in. And I gotta say, the intensity on the verses of this track is just absolutely phenomenal. The whole song has this, like, fucking headlong drive going for it. It's just really motivating and really powerful. Now, the only downside to this track that I could think of is the chorus. Now, on any other track, this chorus would be fantastic. It's really poppy, really, you know, you could really sing along to it. And, really emotional as well. But coming after those intense verses, and when I say intense, I mean absolutely fucking powerhouse intense. I mean, listen to that thing. This chorus, it kind of doesn't fit. It kind of, you would expect the chorus to kind of mirror the intensity of the verses, but on this track, unfortunately, it doesn't. And again, it's a good chorus, and I'm not trying to be negative about it, but coming after those intense verses, it's kind of a letdown, to be honest, and especially after that ominous intro that built up for so goddamn long. But then again, they do repeat the verses multiple times throughout the track, at least like 3 or 4 times, so you do get a nice chunk of that intensity. But then when it gets into that chorus, for me at least, it's a slight letdown. But overall, this song is actually phenomenal. I mean, it's one of my favorites on the album, and again, just want to emphasize, I do like that chorus. But really cool, really melodic, and I love how at the end of the song it kind of gets into this beautiful, haunting piano theme, and the whole song, the whole mood of the track just kind of drops off. It gets really, really melancholic at the end there. So really cool stuff. You also get some cool flute, that cool like flute synthesizer kind of tone I was talking about in the previous track at the end, which is nice as well, and really gives it that nice uplifting feel before getting into that melancholic piano that ends the track and leads right into the next one. So without further ado, let's talk about the next song. I'm going to give Duchess a very strong 9.5 out of 10. It's almost perfect.
There was a choice, but now it's gone.
Coming in at track number 3, guys, we got guide vocal. And although it's only 1.5 minutes long, this has got to be one of the most heartfelt, one of the most impactful moments on the entire album. It's driven by this absolutely haunting, melancholic piano melody by Tony Banks that segued right out of Duchess perfectly there. So again, this is another one of those songs that was part of the Duchess suite, and the flow from the previous track is just absolutely seamless. And this is what I'm talking about with Phil Collins' vocals. His emotion on this track, his voice is so velvety and so melancholic that you can't help but feel for the guy. And the song itself, I think it's about burning bridges, just really just ending a relationship. There's even a line that says, "Take what's yours and be damned," and it's just a beautiful, haunting line. It really affects me every time I hear it. Just one of the most emotional tracks, and one of the best ballads on the entire album. Definitely the most somber, the most melancholic of them all. And it's a big highlight for me. So although on first listen you might not think much of it, it really does leave a lasting impression on you guys. And I think it's one of the most passionate Phil Collins vocal moments. I'm going to give this song a 9.5 out of 10. I don't care. I love it that much.
I'm gonna make a speak for the rest, but I don't understand.
Coming in at track 4, we got Man of Our Times, which is a really cool song, guys. Really unique on the album because it doesn't really fit into any of those buckets I was talking about earlier. It's not a ballad. It isn't really an upbeat rocker. It's not like one of those more symphonic prog songs like the last track on the album. It's kind of its own thing. And what makes this song unique is it kind of plods along at this dirgy mid-tempo kind of pace, but in a good way, in a really hypnotic way. And I think Tony Banks's main synthesizer riff throughout the track just really puts you into a trance, combined with Phil Collins' vocals that kind of had this distortion, this muddy kind of distortion effect to it during the verses. It's really cool and really hypnotic and droning in a sense. But I love it. But then all of a sudden the song just stops and this absolutely uplifting symphonic synthesizer riff comes in, and the chorus comes in, and it's such a powerful moment on the album with Phil Collins just singing "Man of Our Times." Oh, again with those little oohs and ahs there. It's a little bit going for that poppy commercial vibe. But before you know it, it gets right back into the grittiness and the dirginess of the opening riff, with a little bit of keyboard flourishes here and there, and again those Phil Collins distorted vocals. Almost sounds like he's like screaming underneath the surface to break free at some points there. But yeah, when that chorus kicks in, it's an absolutely uplifting moment on the album, and a really good change of pace within the song. So a very dynamic track. I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but it was written by Mike Rutherford. It was one of the songs that he had kind of pre-formed before writing the album. So really interesting song. It's really unique on the album. I would give Man of Our Times easily a 9 out of 10.
Well, I've been waiting for this weekend. I thought that maybe we could see a show.
All right, the next track here, Misunderstanding, a huge hit for the band. We all know it. We all love it, or you might not, but we all know that this was a big, big hit for Genesis. And it really says something when you could switch on any radio station today, whether it be pop, classic rock, whatever. Turn on a radio station, and chances are this song is playing on at least one of them. It was just a huge hit for Genesis, and it has so much commercial appeal. But for some reason, I've never gotten sick of this track. Usually poppy songs like this, they're good the first few times you hear it, but there's not enough musical substance to keep you coming back for more. But I don't know what it is about this song, guys. There's just something about it. Maybe because it's Genesis. Maybe, I don't know what it is, but I keep coming back, and I haven't gotten sick and tired of this song just yet. Maybe maybe 10 years from now, that'll be a different story, but right now, it still sounds fresh. And this really is just a prime example of how to write a short, succinct, 3-minute pop tune, which Genesis were never able to do back in the past, but for some reason, Phil Collins just summoned this ability to write pop songs out of nowhere, and this is one of his best in my opinion. It's got everything. It's got the catchy hook, it's got the catchy female backup singers doing a little Beach Boys doo-wop singing over there, and it's really nice. But I think what keeps me coming back to this track is the really the almost melancholic section in the middle that describes the guy getting fucked over by the chick in the song, which is basically what the song's all about, just somebody getting stood up. And it's really cool when he sings, "Well, I've been waiting for this week," and it really sets up that anticipation that he was feeling, and makes you feel for the guy. It's a really emotional song, and there's some great melodic bass lines during that section as well. So I really think that section there kind of makes the song. If it didn't have that, then yeah, I would probably agree this is kind of like a throwaway pop tune. But I love that melancholic part in the middle, and it comes again at the end as well, and it's really nice, really haunting there. Really melodic bass lines. I think I already mentioned that. But yeah, Misunderstanding, it's a great tune. I would give it an 8.5 out of 10.
Beware the fisherman who's casting out his line into a dried up riverbed. But don't try to tell him, 'cause he won't believe.
Closing out side one, absolutely one of the most underrated Genesis songs ever, in my opinion, Heathaze. I don't know what to say about this song, guys. I've always found this song to be a huge highlight on the album right from day one, and it seems like no one shares my enthusiasm. I don't know what it is. This song here just gets to me. Like, it's really emotional for me. It sends shivers up and down my spine every single time. I love how the song just starts off as this kind of piano ballad with Collins, again, singing very softly, kind of like he did on Trick of the Tail, Wind and Wuthering, and Then There Were Three. You know, not really emoting that much. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but not really giving it that power. And it just has this sleepy kind of autumn kind of quality to it that you would expect from something off Wind and Wuthering. But before you know it, the song absolutely explodes with one of the greatest Genesis climaxes, in my opinion. And I don't say that lightly, because they've had so many climaxes. But when that part comes in and Phil Collins starts singing, he's back 100%. I mean, he's putting that power into his vocals that we'd heard on earlier tracks on the album. And it's just so uplifting, so emotional, and so passionate. It feels like something like Undertow, for example, when the song really builds up to that emotional climax. And it's just so touching, especially when he says, "I feel like an alien, a stranger in an alien place." It's like the themes of isolation running through the song are just so melancholic. And I keep using that word, but it's true. A lot of these songs are really melancholic, but yet uplifting at the same point. And you just honestly just close your eyes and let that climax just wash over you, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's one of the most powerful Genesis moments. Then it gets back to the original theme of the song, you know, with the sleepy kind of piano ballad with Phil Collins singing. And again, it's very beautiful. But when it climaxes again at the end and it extends that climax, one of the best moments for me, guys. Honestly, Heathaze, I wish more people talked about this track. For me, it's so emotional, and it seems like all of my friends that are into Genesis, when I mention the album Duke, and I mention how much I love this song, they don't really see where I'm coming from. So I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe this song just speaks to me on a personal level. But tell me what you guys think down below. Does this song touch you as much as it touches me? Because I really want to know. I'm really curious. So anyway, guys, Heathaze, 9.5 out of 10. One of those big moments for me, one of those powerful Genesis moments.
It's driving me mad. Just another way of passing the day. I get so lonely when she's not there.
Flipping the album over to side 2, Turn It On Again, guys. This song here, I know we've heard it a million times. It's a Genesis live staple, but it really deserves to be. This has to be one of my all-time favorite pop rock songs of all time. It's just absolutely perfect. It's just this short 3.5-minute upbeat song, but it's just perfectly crafted. Everything, all the elements just seem to fall into place, and it has this special something about it that just pumps you up every single time and just elevates your mood. And it has this driving, motivational kind of feel, almost like symbolizing somebody just throwing the past behind them and going forward and doing new things, diving into new scenarios, and really making the most out of your life. Anyway, that's what I get from it. But what a fucking good song. I mean, the way it starts off with these almost like these power chords coming in, and Tony Banks with this really thumping synthesizer riff that goes throughout the entire track, giving it this fucking pulse, like the dun 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 dun. And then all of a sudden, the main riff comes in, a really memorable guitar riff by Mike Rutherford. Again, really rocking, has that classic rock edge, but it's really memorable too. The it's such a feel-good riff. Honestly, I fucking love the riff. And then Phil comes in, and his vocals are back to the max on this song. Like, they're again, I'm going to keep using this word, but so powerful, and have this intensity and this kind of drive to them that we never heard from Phil Collins yet. And it gets really epic as well. The part where he says, I, and then the keyboards come in, dun, 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 I, dun, dun, get so lonely when she's not there. So climactic. And then after that, you get that, again, that symphonic Tony Banks keyboard sound coming in, giving it a little bit of that progressive rock edge. And then a little jazzy keyboard flourish with that, did it, and then going back into the main riff again. I love that. It's just perfectly crafted, that how that sequence of events takes place in the track. And it's interesting because there's no real chorus on the song until the ending, the last minute or so of the track, when the actual chorus of the song comes in, and just they let that just run to the end of the song. Just extremely melodic, extremely catchy, and it has that hook, that poppy kind of feel to it, especially with the layered vocals. And yeah, just a really unique rockin' song that has a very strange structure to it, but really cool, and packs a lot into its 3.5 minute time frame. So I wanted to make sure I gave this song my love, because it's absolutely one of the best pop rock songs I ever heard. Easily like a 9 to a 9.5 out of 10. Like, you don't get songwriting like this these days. Like, interesting songwriting, but yet accessible, short, succinct, and above all, catchy. That's what I love about Turn It On Again. One of those better poppy Genesis tunes.
I know that I'll be alone again tonight.
Now, this next track here, Alone Tonight, you know what, if I had to pick a song to kind of trim off the album, it would definitely be this one. It's a Mike Rutherford composition. Again, one of those rare songs that they actually had fully formed before getting into the album. And the problem with this track for me is that it's just simply too long. Like, this should have been like a 2.5 minute song at the longest. It's basically just a love ballad, but it doesn't have the sincerity or the resonance that a lot of the other ones did, especially considering we had tracks like Guide Vocal already, Heathaze, just songs that really packed an emotional punch. This one here, sure, it has that anthemic big chorus, really kind of like the loser's anthem. The chorus is basically just singing, I'm alone again tonight. Just some fucking dude who fucked up, feeling sorry for himself and sobbing over whatever the hell happened. Probably some romance falling apart. And musically, it isn't that special either. So really, out of all the songs on this album, this one could have been taken off. Again, it's a pretty long album. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned the length of this thing. It's 55 minutes. So again, well over the amount of time that should be on a vinyl. I'd say 45-minute max was like the norm at the time. But Genesis just had this knack for expanding that shit somehow. I don't know, they had some kind of sorcery. And I feel like 55 minutes, if they took off this 5-minute track, it would have been a little bit more manageable to listen to in one sitting. But yeah, Alone Tonight, overall, it's still not a bad song, just compared to the greatness that came before it, especially Turn It On Again, that energetic rocker. I'm going to have to give this song probably a 7.5 to an 8 out of 10, because I still kind of like it, but in the context of the whole album, it's not one of the best moments.
After all, you're not what you thought you were at all. You're just a natural fact. Another Cul De Sac on nature's hard unreeling trail.
Alright, next track on the album, Cul De Sac. Another Tony Banks composition, and this one here is really the first of what I would consider the really overtly progressive prog rock sounding songs on this album. And if you take into account that this track here is about 5.5 minutes and the closing 10-minute epic, that's about 15 minutes of this album being just pure prog rock. So there's still a lot to latch onto for those progressive rock fans. And this one here, it just reeks of Tony Banks. I mean, this is Tony Banks at his absolutely most self-indulgent. I mean, his keyboard, his synthesizer parts on this song are absolutely overbearing and in your face, but they're actually good and memorable, so you can't really fault them. Absolutely symphonic. I mean, this song here is what really defines symphonic progressive rock because his synthesizer parts sound absolutely orchestral on this. And it really gives it that grand, really that grandiose epic feel that a lot of the preceding tracks didn't really have, like Misunderstanding, Alone Tonight, things like that. Turn It On Again, although fantastic, it didn't have those big progressive rock chords that we missed from Genesis. But here it is on Cul De Sac. So if you're a progressive rock fan saying, they lost their touch, play this song and I'm sure you'll be very happy. But yeah, actually, this song here grew on me a lot. I never used to think of it as a fantastic song, but now I absolutely do. And it's just got so much going for it. So right, starting off from the beginning, it kind of has this false intro with just piano and Phil Collins' soft melodic vocals. You think it's going to be another track like Alone Tonight or maybe even the intro of Heathaze, but it takes a totally different direction because it just swells up into this huge synthesizer riff. The dun, 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 dun. It's really triumphant and again, really epic and grandiose sounding. And what I love about this track, similar to Tony Banks' other song on the album, Duchess, when Phil Collins comes in, he just has this fucking intensity to his voice, just like the way he came in with Duchess, and I really like it. I love the flow in his vocals, and he's really bringing it. Really epic melody, really gives that, again, that orchestral edge, and almost oriental sounding with that main riff there. So, doesn't really fit in with the rest of the album in terms of, like, the theme. I think it has to do with, I don't know, a king or something like that. Just your typical Tony Banks, fantasy-inspired stuff. But it could be, you never know. And there's some heavy bass kind of grounding the song, some really heavy bass lines. Again, I really think Mike Rutherford's bass work stands out on this album. There's a lot of moments where I sit back and I think to myself, like, damn, that bass is really holding this whole song together. So, great bass player. I don't know if I already mentioned that. And the song has a great chorus as well. So, unlike Duchess, where I felt like the chorus didn't match the grandiose intensity of the verses, this song absolutely does. And it's a really cool chorus. Again, very keyboard dominated during the chorus as well. And then Tony Banks breaks out that fluty keyboard effect that he used a few times earlier on the album, which gives it that nice kind of, again, giving you that Peter Gabriel vibe. So that progressive edge that he brought with his flute playing, but all packed into Tony Banks' keyboard parts. So really cool. And then it winds down, but then it builds up again with this really, really intense section, almost sinister sounding. Phil Collins with his vocals just dramatically building up to a climax. And then really when he sings the line, "No, not even one," and that synth washes in again, that's another big moment on the album. But yeah, a lot to say about this track. Really, a really progressive song, a lot of twists and turns. Really the highlight is Phil Collins and just the intensity of his vocals and Tony Banks' symphonic playing. So yeah, Cul De Sac, I would give this one, let's say a 9 to a 9.5 out of 10. I really like it.
But enough of me. Tell me, how will you look good? You look good. Well, you lost some weight, I can see.
This song here, guys, please don't ask, absolutely fucks me up every single time I hear it. It is so emotionally strenuous to listen to. I honestly feel like I feel like this weird sense in the pit of my stomach every time I hear the song. It's just a really unpleasant feeling, but in a good way, because I do fucking love the song. But you could really feel, like, especially knowing the backstory, that this song was very painful for Phil Collins to write, but he really had to. This song here is just directly addressing his divorce, and, you know, how he misses his kids, and, you know, he misses, you know, he although he went through all this turmoil with his wife and everything, he still recognizes that she's a good mother. He says she's a mother to the world. So again, that metaphor there, just saying that his kids are the world to him. It's just really emotional. Really unlike any other Genesis song. That no other Genesis song deals with like real human emotions as well as this song. It's just a really honest one. And songs like this really make songs like Alone Tonight stick out as being insincere. This song here is probably the most sincere, heartbreaking song I've ever heard in my life, to be honest. And coming from Genesis, that's rare. But yeah, I always get this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach every time I hear this. But it's an absolutely beautiful song. Obviously, Phil Collins is just emoting just like only he could. Like no one else could have possibly emoted this song as well as him, because it's about him. It's about his life. It's about what he went through. And musically speaking, it isn't very complex. I do like Mike Rutherford's bluesy guitar lines in the background. They add a little bit of musical flair to this song. But overall, it's just a really heartfelt ballad. Has a really nice chorus. And, when Phil Collins says, "I miss my boy, I hope he's good as gold," how can you not get goosebumps to that? And you know what? Just, I can't believe like the stone-hearted people out there. I hear so many people saying that this is a shitty Genesis song. It should have never been on the album. Oh, it's a Phil Collins solo song. Like, what? Do you not have a heart? Like, do you not feel the emotion and the human turmoil that this song conveys? I mean, come on, you got to have a heart of stone to not be moved by this track. But I guess in this day and age, that's not very hard. So please don't ask. One of my personal favorites, one of the best ballads. I don't know if I like it better than Heathaze. Those two songs, just I always debate between the two. But this one's easily a 9.5 out of 10, just for the sheer sincerity of it. Musically speaking, sometimes I'd give it a 9 because the music isn't really up to snuff with the other tracks on the album. But lyrically, it's one of the greatest. So yeah, that's Please Don't Ask. Sometimes I skip this song because it's kind of painful to listen to. But if you want to have a good cry, then play this tune, and I guarantee you will. The ending of this album does not disappoint at all, guys. Closing out the album, we get the 1-2 punch, or really the one punch. I consider these two songs to be really the same thing. Duke's Travels and Duke's End, which is basically this massive symphonic prog rock 10.5-minute magnum opus. For the most part, it's an instrumental. It does reprise guide vocal, giving one of the strongest Genesis moments of all time. But a good 85% of this song is instrumental. And what an extravaganza it is. Again, this is the prime example I look to when I think of people saying Duke is a sellout album. It isn't. It's not even debatable. I mean, look at this song here. They had the balls to put a 10.5-minute prog rock experimental masterpiece. And really the whole band is cooking on this song. From first listen, it sounds like Tony Banks is really the one dominating it. And although most of the melodies and most of the crazy solos are based on the synth and the keyboard, man, Phil Collins' drumming is absolutely heavy as fuck on this song. And Mike Rutherford's bass lines, you gotta listen for them, but they're absolutely ridiculous. Some of his best bass lines, and again, some of his best bass work on this album. I can't say that enough. But really, Duke's Travels, symphonic prog masterpiece. And you could debate me on this all day, guys. I'll never change my opinion. This really is Genesis 100% progressive rock. Not even 1% pop rock. So shove it up your ass. But yeah, Duke's Travels, so much to say about this track. It has a really, really long intro. 2 minutes of basically just this Tony Banks setting up the atmosphere with this really airy but tension-laden keyboard intro, or synthesizer intro, I should say. Really vast, grandiose feel we have here, but you feel like there's something brooding under the surface. And then before you know it, at the 1 minute, 37-second mark, Phil Collins comes in with absolutely pounding drums straight out of the heart of Africa. I mean, these drums are absolutely pounding, almost sound like congos, if you could put it that way. And then before you know it, this really menacing synthesizer riff comes in. It has this force, this heaviness that a lot of Tony Banks synth riffs don't have, which I really like. It goes like this. And basically, it has that drive, it has that heaviness to it, and Phil Collins' heavy drumming is just going throughout this entire section. Then on top of this main synthesizer riff, Tony Banks is just soloing all over the place. I mean, the next 2.5 minutes of this track is just Tony Banks going absolutely bonkers on the keyboards, just soloing his heart out, and it's no joke. I mean, it's no surprise to see why this is Tony Banks' favorite album, because when you hear stuff like this, the self-indulgence of his keyboard playing, thank God Tony Banks is one of the greatest keyboard players in progressive rock, because a mediocre keyboard player would come across as extremely pretentious doing something like this, but it's Tony Banks, and he knew he had the talent, and he pulls it off fantastically. Just great soloing there. Then we get into this really sleazy, jazzy kind of lounge jazz kind of sounding synth intro, or synth part that comes in with these really long extended notes, giving it this kind of sleazy feel. But then it gets a little bit more optimistic. It reprises the main riff, but in a more optimistic kind of way. So instead of that heavy you're getting more of this airy keyboards in the background, giving it this lighter kind of tone. So just a different take on that original riff, which is pretty cool. And again, Tony Banks just soloing the hell out of this part. This is where we're about 4 minutes and 40 seconds into the song, and then all of a sudden it just gets really, really intense. Some great bass lines, some great guitar coming in there, and a really frantic part of the song there. Now, the 5 minute and 50-second mark, I had to timestamp this shit, guys, is one of my favorite Genesis moments of all time. Honestly, from this point onward, right to the end of Duke's End, one of the best Genesis songs ever. We get this flurry of keyboard notes with this wailing guitar matching it in the background. I mean, damn, Mike Rutherford really had a lot of feel during this section, and it feels like the whole song has just been accumulating to this point, and it feels like your spirit is just lifting up into the heavens. It's just fucking fantastic. So emotional. And then guide vocal is reprised and Phil Collins comes in, and that has got to be one of the most goosebump inducing Genesis moments of all time. One of the strongest moments in progressive rock history. And I really don't say that lightly. When guide vocal comes in, that there is really nothing like it. After all that crazy soloing and instrumentation, not one word had been spoken, and then that comes in, and it brings you back to the earlier points in the album, reprising its greatness. Just fucking amazing. I can't even describe how great it is. Man, when he sings "Take What's Yours and Be Damned," it gets into this extremely emotional keyboard section with the kind of reprising the main theme of the guide vocal. And at this point, you're on cloud nine. It's just, there's no words to describe how euphoric it is. Just the perfect ending to the song. Then it winds down. You think the song's going to close. But all of a sudden, this weird flute. Again, Tony Banks loved that flute effect on this album. He breaks out his keyboard. And then we transition into Duke's End, which starts off as a fantastic reprise of the main riff on Behind the Lines. So again, the very first thing you hear on the album, coming this late. But it has this extra punch, this extra intensity. I can't really describe it. It sounds like the whole band is just fucking accelerating at this point. Then it randomly kicks into the Turn It On Again main riff, which is so great, so rocking. And I gotta emphasize Mike Rutherford's bass lines here. Just, you don't really have to listen carefully to hear these. They are standout bass lines, and it's just a really epic moment before finally wrapping up with that original riff again from Behind the Lines, closing out the entire album. Just such a powerful way to close it out. I mean, kind of misleading. The first 4.5 minutes of the song are extremely proggy, extremely instrumental keyboard soloing. But then when that emotional apex kicks in, right up to the end of the track, you're on cloud nine and you weren't expecting it. And it just really goes to show that although Genesis, they were virtuosos, they did love going into lengthy instrumental passages. They always knew how to serve the song, and they always knew how to break out those extremely emotional climaxes that only Genesis can really do. So, needless to say, guys, Duke's Travels and Duke's End gets a 10 out of 10 for me, hands down. Best song on the album. And one of my favorite Genesis songs, to be honest. It's definitely in my top 20. And what a way to close out the album. So, guys, thanks for sticking around. That was my review of Duke. I know it was kind of lengthy, but there's a lot of songs on this album, and I'm really passionate about it. Again, as you could tell from my review, there's a lot of songs that really hit me emotionally. And I guess if you never really made that emotional connection to the album, I could kind of see why you would think this album was just kind of a sellout. But trust me, once you make that emotional connection, it just sticks with you for life and will become one of your all-time favorite Genesis albums. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say about this one, guys. So stay tuned for my next review. It might be Abacab. It might not be. We'll see what happens. But I think you'll be very surprised to hear my opinion on Abacab. I'm not going to ruin it for you guys, but I like it. Kind of ruined it there, but anyway. So thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe, with the coronavirus. Don't let it fuck you up. And as always, rock on.